Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first of two author visits that we're hosting here as part of National Novel Writing Month at the Ohio Center for the Book at Cleveland Public Library. Um, my name is Mike. I work here at the Ohio Center for the Book at Cleveland Public Library. And today we are very happy to be joined by author Alison Stine. Alison is the author of the novels Road Out of Winter, which won the 2021 Philip K. Dick Award, and most recently, Trashlands. She's published three poetry collections, including a chapbook with the Wick Poetry Center and Kent State University, which is one of my favorite Ohio literary institutions. She's received a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, a Wallace Stegner Fellowship, and a Ruth Lilly Fellowship. And that's one heck of a trifecta there. So that's really cool. Alison, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm going to begin with this because I want to talk a little bit about your poetry. Um, and that's, how did you start writing? How did you get into this?
Oh gosh, I can't even remember. I've been writing for as long as I can remember. I think one of my first memories is my parents were having dinner and I was like on the kitchen floor. I was a toddler or something, and I was just trying to write down a story. But my mom was a reading teacher, and so she taught me how to read really early, and she would just write down the stories I told her. Which at that time, they were about like snowmen and pancakes and all the really important things in a child's life. But um, we lived in the country. I didn't have many friends my own age until I went to school. My babysitter was an elderly farmer's wife, and she would just apparently just put me outside and tell me to occupy myself. And so I just kind of made up words to occupy myself. And I made up worlds too. And that was my company. Books were my company as soon as I could read them. And even before then, my parents read them to me. And then as soon as I could write, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to tell stories.
And that's really interesting too. I know a lot of writers who don't start until they get into the sort of graduate school aspect of it, where you realize you could get funded graduate school time to write and stuff like that, and they pursue it that way. So I'm interested then, you spoke a little bit about world building. So how did you get into poetry, which seems like it may be your first successes at least,
Well,
right?
as much as one can be successful as a poet, I know the struggle is real, as we all know. Um, well, I mean, I didn't, I grew up in a small town in Ohio, and back then we didn't have Barnes and Nobles or Amazon. We had a Walden Books at the mall, and it had this very, very tiny classical section and a very, very tiny poetry section. And I just really early on, I discovered Emily Dickinson, who was a big influence on me. And I had a teacher in junior high that introduced me to Edna St. Vincent Millay. And I've always been interested in music as well. And I just felt like, poems were a way to have music through words, to tell a song in a different kind of form. And that always interested me. I'm sure being young, the short nature of poems also interested me. I could tell a story quickly. I could tell many stories in one tiny snapshot, which I also liked. Um, then when I went to college, I originally went to college thinking there was going to be a fiction writer there, but by the time I arrived, he had moved on, and there were only poets. And they were very encouraging of poetry and me writing poetry, and so I thought that's what writers did. I thought that this was the way to be a literary writer, was through poetry. I know now that there's many ways to be a writer and many types of things to write, but at the time when I was first starting out, I thought this was the way to tell my stories.
Okay, awesome. And was there a moment when writing became more than something that you just do on the side, like where it really became like your life?
Well, I always knew that that's what I wanted to do. I think I first realized that you could do it as a career when I was pretty young, maybe in high school, and I read Anne of Green Gables by Ellen Montgomery. And that was the first time I think I'd read a writer as a character, a writer, and that was her job. I didn't know that could be your job. And of course, it is my job now. I'm a full time writer, but as I tell people, I write for a living, but I don't always write what I want for a living. I work in journalism, so a lot of my day job writing is, assigned to me or is a topic that I wouldn't necessarily choose. Um, so I think very young, I realized that I wanted to do this. I also knew very young that you can't usually just do that. You can't usually just write novels. You definitely can't usually just write poetry, right? You have to have another day job. So at first I thought my day job was going to be academia because that's what the writers that taught me did. They taught at the college level. But that job never materialized for me. So I had to find another way and my way was through journalism.
Yeah, and I think, the writer Blake Butler, he put it really well, that you have to find something that's sort of relevant and adjacent to what you really want to do as a writer, right?
Yeah, I really like that. That's a good way.
Mhm. Yeah. So when you're writing other things professionally, maybe the things that you're not so jazzed about, uh, does that affect your fiction, your writing?
Oh, it definitely does. I mean, I think all writing makes you a better writer. I also think that all art makes you a better writer or a better artist. I'm one of those people that really believes it's all connected, music and writing and theater and visual art. Um, just being in the world makes you a better writer and caring about things and learning about things. For a long time, I was a freelance reporter, and every day I would learn something new or have to become an expert on something or meet somebody and talk to them. And, just being exposed to the world like that really helps what you write about. But also, there's aspects of journalism that does really help creative writing. I've learned to be very concise. I have to get to the point. I have to focus on people early. And so all of that has really helped my fiction for sure.
Yeah. And certainly there's an aspect of where you have to focus on the truths when you're dealing with these things and those right the most difficult aspect of probably writing a novel is being truthful even in fictional writing, right?
Well, I mean, what I've learned to say is that the stories aren't true in my fiction, but the feelings are all mine.
Exactly.
The
Yep.
emotion is all mine, and I don't think of writing as therapy, it's much more than that, but in many regards, writing is a good place to put those feelings,
Mhm.
especially if you don't understand what to do with them or you're trying to work through them, and that, of course, is very true. Those feelings are very true.
And when did you sort of move from poetry to fiction? What sort of pushed you that direction?
That's a good question. I always wanted to be a novelist. That is the one genre of writing that I actually never studied. I studied poetry and then I got my PhD in nonfiction writing. And I did that. Obviously, I love all genres, but I also felt like that was what I was supposed to do. That was where the jobs were. That was where people expected me to get a degree based on my experience. But I always wanted to be a fiction writer. And I never really studied fiction writing. Books were my teachers. I'd read and continue to read a ton of books, especially novels. That's always what I was drawn to, even when I was more seriously writing poetry. But I tried for many years to write novels. I had an agent who dropped me. I had another agent who dropped me. I just wrote book after book that just didn't work. They just didn't feel right. And I think I had written about 7 novels that hadn't gone anywhere. And I was a single mom, my child was young, and I was just so desperate and fed up with it. I decided to write the most like messed up, passionate, ridiculous book I could. And that became Road Out of Winter. And that one worked. That one worked.
And so and I would love to hear a little bit more about the 7 not failed novels, but novels
They
that
were
didn't.
good.
But those are really important to the process, right, of you working towards writing the novel that became the novel for you, right?
For sure.
Uh,
All writing teaches you how to do better writing. It's like lily pads that you're bouncing on to get to your frog or the end of the pond. They all help you get there.
and where does poetry still inform your prose, your fiction? What is the influence there?
I think it's definitely still in my language. I'm very concerned with music, with how things sound. It was a harder time for me in fiction, and of course, I'm still learning to figure out how to move people from place to place. Because in poetry, it was so much more about the moment and didn't worry about transitions so much. So walking that line between beautiful lyric language and plot is definitely something that is still a big part of my life. I think that sometimes I don't make sometimes my fiction is too poetic, according to some people. I was just rejected. I had a project rejected because they said it was too literary, it was too poetic. So I think trying to find that balance between the beautiful language of poetry and the more plot-driven conflict of fiction is like my greatest journey, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, and certainly, Trashlands especially, there's just a boatload of symbolism. We did a book club on that book just a couple months ago, earlier this year, and people were just mesmerized by the use of, the color red, for example, I think the blood river, the hair, um, and I'm hoping we'll talk a little bit about the whale from the beginning too. Um, we'll do that after you read. So I definitely see that. Um, so you've published, well, 2 novels with 1 on the way, right?
Yes, that's right.
So the process, has that changed for you, with each book?
It has a little bit. I mean, it's really different writing a book when you don't think anybody is going to read it, which is how I wrote my first novel. Like yet again, a book no one's going to read that I pour my soul into for years, you know. So that is very different than writing a book that you think there's a strong possibility that someone will read it and either accept it or reject it and deal with that. It's a different pressure and it's a difficult pressure. Both Road Out of Winter and Trashlands, I just wrote them. I didn't have a contract for them. I wrote them. Then I found an agent and, you know, we approached publishers. But with my next book, Dust, which is coming out next year, I got a contract for that. You know, my agent said, "Hey, publishers are really interested in this one thing, the idea of climate fiction for young adults, or a climate novel with a young adult as the main character." And I said, "Oh, I'm not going to write that. I don't have time." But, you know, I'm a type A personality. I want to get an A on everything. And I kept thinking about it. And then, of course, I came up with an idea and I decided to write it. But, and with that book, we wrote an outline. We gave them a couple sample chapters. They accepted that. And then I had to write the damn thing. And that was rough. That was really, really hard. And I think in the future, I'm going to try to write the whole book before I tell my agent about it or before we try to get it published, because I just write best when I feel like it's just for me, even if it's not. I think I write best when I pretend like it's personal and it's private and there's not people looking over my shoulder. The pressure of publication is difficult to write for sure.
Yeah, and was there, like, a different feeling? You said that you wrote an outline before writing the book, right? Um, sort of trying to live up to the to your own expectations that you set out, like, did that restrict your process any, or did you still feel like you could stray a little bit?
I think I felt some of that pressure for sure. I actually don't usually write outlines when I write a novel. When I first told my agent this, I thought he was gonna fall over. He was so upset. But, you know, everybody's different, and I'm more like a fly by the seat of my pants writer, and I think it's because I like to be surprised, and I like for those moments of discovery as I'm writing, and I've tried before. My first 7 failed novels had these long outlines and index cards on the wall and the whole thing planned out, and then when it came time to write it, I was just really bored, and I did feel hemmed in, I did feel restricted. So there was a bit of that with the outline. What I finally ended up doing for that book under contract was I just forgot about the outline and I just wrote it. And the weird thing is, it did follow the outline pretty well. It didn't deviate too much. I didn't like get in trouble or anything. Um, but the way my brain works is, I guess I just want to be surprised. But other people's brains, they really want that order of the organization. And the way I write, of course, with no outline, that means more work later on. That means my first drafts are a mess and they don't make sense. And I'm trying to tell myself what I'm doing as I go. So I have to do more work in revision. But I actually really love revision. So I don't mind that at all.
And with that in mind, what is your drafting process like? Are you a quick first draft person and then loads of revision, or do you take your time with that first draft before going into the revision process?
Yeah, I'm normally a quick first draft person. Before my son was born, what I used to do is I would write first thing in the morning as soon as I got up, and I would try to get 1,000 words out or whatever the goal was for that day, every day. And then I tried not to look at it, but then the next day I would go back to it. And since having a child and, I have a full-time job in journalism, it's a little more difficult to do that every day. But I do try to draft as quickly as I can and whenever I can. I try not to be precious about that first draft because the hardest thing is just getting it out there, getting it down on paper. And so half of it might be handwritten, half of it might be in my phone. And, there may be a lot of spelling mistakes, but I try not to edit too much as I'm just getting that draft out there.
And related to this, you touch on this a little bit. As you are drafting, as you are writing, you mentioned not being precious about that first draft. Also, sounds like you're not precious about how and when you're able to write. You don't need, I'm assuming, complete silence, a desk, and all that. You're writing whenever you can, whatever means you
Yeah.
possible, really.
That's
Yeah,
very true. I mean, I do have an office in my house for the first time in a long time, but, it's definitely not soundproof. There's no heat and no air conditioning, and I'm interrupted all the time. And that's just how it is, it's not gonna be that way forever. That's how it is now. I think that's important to keep in mind when you're writing is that, you might not have ideal circumstances right now, but they will change, and the trick is just to keep going and hang in there until they change for the better.
excellent. Let's see. So, do you work on a one book at a time, or do you try to work on a few different things to try to keep an interest going in these different projects?
Yeah, I do work on one book at a time. Sometimes I have to stop kind of in midstream if something happens in the publishing process. For example, I was drafting a new novel last year and it was going really well. And then I got edits back on my next book under contract. So when you get those edits back, they don't give you a lot of time on them. So I had to stop everything and move to this other thing. And that was hard because you carry the books with you kind of like ghosts, so it definitely bleeds over a little bit. But then that again goes back to you can't be precious about it. You've got to get it done and get it done, and then you can work on making it perfect. So especially with that first draft, I'm just really trying to get it on paper.
All right. So with that, would you read a little bit for us?
Oh yeah, sure, I'd love to.
Right.
Uh, I'm gonna read like the first part of Trashlands. Trashlands, I can talk more about this later if you want, but it came to me in a dream. The main character, Coral, came to me in a dream. I was, sleeping in a school bus at the time, and I had gone there to work on a book, and I forget what book it was, because that night I couldn't sleep, and I dreamed this woman came to me and she told me a story. And so I thought it was going to be her story and her story alone. But then I discovered it's really a community, and I really want to hear from all these community members, or as many as I can. So many of the chapters are in Coral's voice, but some of them are in other characters' voices too. But I'm going to start with Coral. Coral was pregnant then. She hid it well in a dress she had found on the road, sun bleached and mud dotted, only a little ripped. The dress billowed to her knees, over the tops of her boots. She was named for the wildflower, which hadn't been seen since before her birth, and for ocean life, poisoned and gone. It was too dangerous to go to the beach anymore. You never knew when storms might come, though they were going to get a whale. A boy had come from up north with a rumor. A whale had beached, far off its course, but everything was off by then. The water waves, the paths to the ocean, its salt. You went where you had to go, where weather and work and family, but mostly weather, took you. The villagers around Lake Erie were carving the creature up, taking all the good meat and fat. The strainer in its mouth could be used for bows, the bones in its chest for tent poles or greenhouse beams. It was a lot of fuel for maybe nothing, a rumor spun by an out-of-breath boy. But there would be pickings along the road, and there was still gas, expensive, but available. So the group went, led by Mr. Fall. They brought kayaks, lashed to the top of the bus, but in the end, the water was so shallow that they could wade. They knew where to go because they could smell it. You got used to a lot of smells in the world, rotten food, chemicals, but death was hard to get used to. Mask up, Mr. Fall said. Some of the men in the group, all men except Coral, had respirators, painter's masks, or medical masks. Coral had a handkerchief of faded blue paisley knotted around her neck. She pulled it up over her nose. She had dotted it with lavender oil from a vial. She breathed shallowly through fabric and flowers. Mr. Fall just had a t-shirt wound around his face. He could have gotten a better mask, Coral knew, but he was leading the crew. He saved the good things for the others. She was the only girl on the trip, and probably the youngest person. Maybe 15, she thought. Months ago, she had lain in the ice house with her teacher, a man who would not stay. He was old enough to have an old-fashioned name, Robert, to be called after people who had lived and died as they should. Old enough to know better, Mr. Fall had said, but what was better anymore? Everything was temporary. Robert touched her in the straw, the ice blocks sweltering around them. He let himself want her, or pretend to, for a few hours. She tried not to miss him. His hands that shook at her buttons would shake in a fire, or in a swell of floodwater. Or maybe violence had killed him. She remembered it felt cool in the ice house, a relief from the outside where heat beat down. The last of the chillers sputtered out chemicals. The heat stayed trapped in people's shelters, like ghosts circling the ceiling. Heat haunted. It would never leave. News would stop for long stretches. The information that reached Scrapalaccia would be written hastily on damp paper, across every scrawled inch. It was always old news. The whale would be picked over by the time they reached it. Mr. Fall led a practice team. They would not bother Coral, were trained not to mess with anything except the mission. They parked the bus in an old lot, then descended through weeds to the beach. The stairs had washed away, and the beach, when they reached it, was not covered with dirt or rock as Coral had expected, but with a fine yellow grit, so bright it hurt to look at, a blankness stretching on. Take off your boots, Mr. Fall said. Coral looked at him, but the others were listening, knotting plastic laces around their necks, stuffing socks into pockets. Go on, Coral, it's all right. Mr. Fall's voice was gentle, muffled by the shirt. Coral had her job to do. Only Mr. Fall and the midwife knew for sure she was pregnant, though others were talking. She knew how to move so that no one could see. But maybe, she thought, as she leaned on a fence post and popped off her boot, she wanted people to see, to tell her what to do, how to handle it, help her. He had to have died, Robert, and that was the reason he didn't come back for her. Or maybe he didn't know about the baby. People had thought there would be no more time, but there was, just different time, time moving slower, time after disaster, when they still had to live. She set her foot down on the yellow surface. It was warm. She shot a look at Mr. Fall. The surface felt smooth, shifting beneath her toes. Coral slid her foot across, light and slightly painful. It was the first time she had felt sand. The sand on the beach made only a thin layer. People started to take it. Already people knew sand, like everything, could be valuable, could be sold. Coral took off her other boot. She didn't have laces to tie around her neck. She carried the boots under her arm. Sand clung to her, pebbles jabbing at her feet. Much of the trash on the beach had been picked through. What was left was diapers and food wrappers and cigarettes smoked down to filters. Watch yourselves, Mr. Fall said. Down the beach, they followed the smell. It led them on, the sweet rot scent. They came around a rock outcropping, and there was the whale, massive as a ship run aground, red, purple, and white. The colors seemed not real. Birds were on it, the black birds of death, the enemies of scavengers, their competition. Two of the men ran forward, waving their arms to scare off the birds. All right, everybody, Mr. Fall said to the others. You know what to look for. Except they didn't, not really. Animals weren't their specialty. Plastic was. People had taken axes to the carcass to carve off meat. More desperate people had taken spoons, whatever they could use to get at something to take home, for candle wax or heating fuel, or to barter or beg for something else, something better. You ever seen a whale? One of the men, New Orleans, asked Coral. She shook her head. No. This isn't a whale, Mr. Fall said. Not anymore. Keep your masks on. They approached it. The carcass sunk into the sand. Coral tried not to breathe deeply. Flesh draped from the bones of the whale. The bones were arched, soaring like buttresses, things that made up cathedrals, things she had read about in Mr. Fall's book. Bracing his arm over his mouth, Mr. Fall began to pry at the ribs. They were big and strong. They made a cracking sound, like a splitting tree. New Orleans gagged and fell back. Other men were dropping. Coral heard someone vomiting into the sand. The smell was so strong it filled her head and chest like a sound, a high ringing. She moved closer to give her feet something to do. She stood in front of the whale and looked into its gaping mouth. There was something in the whale, something deep in its throat. In one pocket, she carried a knife always, and in the other, she had a light, a precious flashlight that cast a weak beam. She switched it on and swept it over the whale's tongue, picked black by the birds. She saw a mass, opaque and shimmering, wide enough it blocked the whale's throat. The whale had probably died of it, this blockage. The mass looked lumpy, twined with seaweed and muck, but in the mess, she could make out a water bottle. It was plastic, plastic in the animal's mouth. It sparked in the beam of her flashlight. Coral stepped into the whale.
So I would love to talk a little bit about the whale image at the beginning.
Yeah, sure.
It's such a huge image, but the novel does kind of resist going back to it explicitly. It's sort of mentioned here or there. It's such a big image, but it reverberates throughout the rest of the novel. Um, I'm just fascinated. Where did that come from?
Gosh, well, I mean, like everyone, I hope I pay attention, and I have, of course, read about animals beaching before, whales, dolphins, and so forth, and the various reasoning behind them, which I think we don't always know, or scientists don't always know. I've also been very concerned for a long time with the environment and the earth for various reasons. And one of that is, of course, plastic. And if you're paying attention, you know how much plastic ends up in the ocean. And you've probably seen pictures of like a plastic drink ring from a six pack of beer around a turtle's neck, or, various sea creatures or coral twined with plastic, or ruined, upset by plastic. Just a few days ago, I think there was a whale that was rescued that had gotten caught in like a trap, and also like plastic netting was around it. I've never heard of a whale that did have plastic in it, although after Trashlands came out, I did read about that. So, I feel like if you're paying attention as a writer, especially a writer of speculative books, things you write about are gonna happen or in the process of happening. But I wanted something that was big, obviously. I wanted a big, example of what was happening to the earth in this book, and obviously too in our world. I wanted a big kind of majestic creature that had been felled by plastic, something that you can't help but care about. You can't help but see it because it's massive. You're smelling it. It's like a big deal that this is here. So you can't ignore it. But I also wanted a symbol of like how brave Coral was, and she kind of gets a reputation because she does this thing. She goes into the whale to get plastic. And so she's becomes like famous for doing this thing. The fact that she is a child really in the beginning, and she's got to prove herself, and she's worried about being secretly pregnant. I think all that went into making this image like be like a really big motion, a really big action in her life.
So, and one thing that I found really impressive is it really does elevate Coral for the rest of the book, and it does so much in terms of world building as well, that this is Lake Erie, right? That this
Not known
so
for males, right?
not usually, no, not yet, and, yeah, so can you talk a little bit about your process of world building? Because Trashlands is really great in that, the world building is very subtle. For example, the way names are given out to characters,
Mhm.
is like a really smart way of how this world is built. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I don't know how it first came to me. I think, like I said, I did dream the start of it. I did dream a woman named Coral. I knew she was a mom. I knew she was young. I knew she had red hair, and she lived in a bus, probably because I was currently sleeping in a bus, so that probably bled into my dreams. But I knew like she had the name Coral, and and then I was thinking about her partner, and I wanted him to have, like, an interesting name, and I'm from Ohio, and the earth is very important to me, including the environment of Ohio, and Trillium is a name for a flower that I've always loved. It's not like a well-known one. I'm not sure even people in Ohio always know what that is. So once I had Trillium, I realized what they both had in common was not only were they from nature, but they were from nature that was endangered, um, in Ohio and in the world. And so once I had that, I started to do it on purpose. I started to look, and this was kind of depressing research, but I started to research what places and what animals and what natural life might be ruined or made extinct by climate change. And so everyone in the book is named after one of those things.
And you mentioned the sort of depressing aspect of the research. As you're reading and as you start to realize, "Oh, these are cities that will be lost eventually," like, it is really harrowing, how that's sort of, put in there. Um, so what draws you to the dystopian?
Oh gosh. Well, I think it's a few things. Number one, our world. We are living in an apocalypse. It's just kind of different. Many apocalypses are happening at the same time, as we know. Um, but also, even personally, years before I think climate change started to gather so much momentum, and before the pandemic, I was sort of living in my own dystopia. I was a single mom. I lived below the poverty line for many years, most of my son's early life. and I lived in rural Appalachia, which I absolutely love and was my home, and I will fight for it to the death. But it did have some problems, it was hard to make a life there. Certain things were very difficult. Our power would go out all the time. We always had to boil our water. I became kind of survivalist in that sense because I had to learn how to survive. And so I think for me, writing this dystopia and the dystopia of Road Out of Winter, they were an escape because it was different. It wasn't worrying about sending my son to school or worried about gun violence or worried about global warming. It was in Road Out of Winter, it's global cooling. It's just something different. And so it provided an escape for me because it was different than our current world. But also I think it was a way, like I said before, a place for me to put my feelings about like the climate crisis, but a place for me to put feelings that could maybe have some action. you know I mean, characters in both my books get stuff done. They save each other. They build a community. They make it work. They make a life out of plastic in Trashlands. Um, and so they have more agency in their lives than I guess I was feeling in my life. And I think, especially when it comes to the climate crisis, we can feel that a helplessness because, none of us are politicians. We're not billionaires. We don't own factories. Like, we can't really do a lot as individuals. So writing was something that I could do.
And you talked about your characters sort of coming together, finding ways to get through things. Trashlands, one really sort of prominent aspect of many of the main characters there is the importance of art
Mm.
as what they do and as their identities as well, right? As artists. And you mentioned that you believe that for you, art is really part of all aspects of your life, right? And can you speak a little bit about that, the importance of art, both to you and maybe a little bit in Trashlands?
Yeah, well, I did a talk the other day actually at Lit Youngstown, and I was thinking about like the purpose of art. And then I realized, well, one of the purposes of art is that it has no purpose. It just is. It's beautiful, or it's dark, or it's weird, or it's funny, or it's sad, or it's hopeful. It's just something that we made. And I think nothing makes us more human, I guess, than making art. And nothing would make us feel more human, even in the face of like a changed world and horrible crisis than making art. There's also a lot in Trashlands about making art not for profit, not for personal gain, even because Coral makes sculptures out of junk, out of plastic, and she doesn't sign it and she just abandons it. She leaves it in the woods, she leaves it in a tree. The only reason she makes it is to make it, and also to maybe help someone feel better, to maybe make someone smile when they walk by or wonder. There's so little magic left in the world. We know so much about so many things, right? Everything's been discovered. But I think that art is still magic that we have. We don't know where it comes from. We don't know why we make it. We don't always know what it means. And I think that's totally fine and great. I was also very interested and involved in street art and graffiti. I have a lot of friends who are street artists, and that culture has really affected me in that, just the pure love of making stuff, just making something because you got an idea or because you're lonely or because you want to make something, and also just leaving it for someone to find. It's not about glory, it's not about money, it's just about making something cool and hoping that someone else feels not alone.
And talking a little bit or thinking a little bit about Ohio. So the regions figure prominently in your two books.
Me too.
Um, did that did you ever resist writing about Ohio, especially starting out? Was there any resistance there?
Definitely. I mean, I think like a lot of people, I thought I had to get out of my hometown and I had to get out of my home state. And I went to college in Ohio, but then I got out and I went to Washington, D.C. and I lived in San Francisco for a while. I lived in New York City, I lived all over. And I wrote about people that I didn't know anything about. I wrote about places I didn't feel a call to. But I kept thinking about home and I kept resisting it, I guess. but it was the thing that really calls to me as a writer. It's where I feel alive, it's where I feel inspired. I feel like Ohio will never run out of stories, and I'll never run out of things I wanna say about Ohio, even a fictionalized Ohio, because, of course, it's not the same in my books, but it's still my home. It's still the river that I used to go to all the time. It's still the trees that I think about, or, like, the hollows I think about, there's just something about home. I think writing it too is an attempt to understand it, even though I can't understand it. You sh p Especially now, right? We're criticized for wanting to live certain places, like, we should only wanna live in these perfect cities. Why would we wanna live in a place that doesn't have sushi, or that's 90 minutes from an airport, or that has terrible local politicians, or environmental dangers, or bad weather? But you can't help where home is, it's just a feeling, and part of it too is the feeling of wanting to help home, wanting to do everything I can for the people that I grew up with, wanting to help make the community the strongest it can be. I think that's a big part of writing about home too.
And, now living in Colorado, it's a drastically different, landscape. Has that affected you in any way? Has that affected your writing?
It has. I mean, my next book is set in Colorado. It's called Dust, and it's about a girl who moves from Ohio to Colorado. And, we moved at the start of the pandemic, which was a whole other experience. But I put a lot of those feelings in the book, like I said, just trying to take in the landscape, but also taking it in from the eyes of someone who's not familiar with it, who doesn't consider it their home, who doesn't have that, like, family connection or calling to it. How can she make it work in this place? It's kinda like how I felt, "How can I make it work in this place?" But it has been really interesting how polar opposite it is. Just the climate is so different. The culture is so different. I still can't get over the lack of trees. I really, really need more trees in my life. I love the mountains, but I'd prefer the mountains with trees on them for sure.
Yeah, I remember the first time I was in Denver, just being so disappointed the mountains weren't everywhere, and that
Yeah,
it's kind of a bummer outside of the mountains, or it was
it
for me, at
was.
least initially,
For some
right?
reason, I thought you could see them everywhere, and you cannot.
Right,
And
right.
also they're kind of far away. Like, it does take a lot of driving through horrible traffic to, like, get to them, which is
Yeah, I
disappointing.
thought it would be like a difficult plane landing and all that, just averting peaks, and nope.
Yeah, there's a lot of plains too.
Mm,
A lot of flat landscape out here as well.
yep. So related to that, a lot of dystopian literature tends to deal with coastal cities, right, or bigger cities. And your book sort of, or Trashlands especially, sort of brings voice to the Midwest and Appalachia in this context. Um, do you feel like this is a region, I mean, at large, literal in literature, it is underrepresented, but even in, dystopian fiction, climate fiction, do you feel like there's an underrepresentation there?
Absolutely. I feel like the books and the stories and the writers and artists are there, but I don't feel like they're getting the attention that they should get. I feel like the stories have been written and they are being written, but they're not gonna get a splashy feature in the New York Times, or they're not gonna get, in People, you're not gonna be interviewed. So I think people still mistakenly believe the coasts as, like, the centers of culture in the country, and I just think there's culture everywhere, and there's so much interesting culture everywhere. For a while, my day job was working at Salon. I was the staff culture writer, and I wrote about books and TV and film. And so because of that, I got invited to like all these premieres all the time. And I could never go to anything because everything was in New York or LA. And nobody just considered that, hey, somebody interested in culture and writing might not be in LA or New York. But we're everywhere. And having lived both in California and New York, I really feel like there's a lot more interesting places to make art, you know? There's more interesting stories to be had in the Midwest and other parts of the country. And there's just, I think, more opportunities to tell our experiences.
Yeah, and there seems to be this pervasive idea that climate change isn't happening, right, in the Midwest because it's not as maybe
Right.
visible, right?
Mhm.
All right. Let's see. Does anybody have any questions in our chat that you'd like to drop in there? Joseph said about you reading that he could have just kept on listening. I agree. Let's see. All right, so this is from Joseph. How has your MFA and PhD informed, shaped, enhanced your fiction writing? Um, and this is a good question too. Are there things that you had to sort of unlearn?
Well, I'm really grateful I got those degrees because of the experiences I had and the people I met. That community that I had in both those degrees was just a really great community. It's not always easy to find people who like what you like, especially if what you like is writing or reading. It's just you know, not as common as you'd think to find other people who get it. So finding people who get it in those communities was a really big deal. And I'm still very good friends with people that I went through my programs with, and I always will be. Um, it does give you time to write, which is really important. It does give you some money. I tell people not to go to grad school unless you can get funding because it's a lot of money to take out for a degree that may not get you a job. Um, but I think I did have to unlearn some things. You're absolutely right. I think, in many regards, the degrees kind of derailed me a bit from the path I was already on. Um, I think I got wrapped up in the idea of academia and that I had to be a professor in order to be a writer, that this was the only job. And I worked really hard to try to be a professor, and I spent many years being an adjunct and an assistant professor, going around the country chasing these jobs. And, that was a lot of my life that I kind of wasted on that dream that I don't think was ever really my dream. My dream was just to write, and I didn't care what my day job was. So I think the PhD program and the MFA program kind of preference that lifestyle. I hope now we're moving more towards realizing that there's many paths to being a writer, and you don't have to be a professor, you don't have to be a teacher, you don't even have to get a degree in writing. So I hope we're finally moving towards that understanding. But I think I also had to unlearn making things like make sense for the workshop or appealing to the reader, which is sometimes appealing to like the lowest common denominator reader. Not everybody's going to like your piece, not everybody's going to like your book, not everybody's going to like you. And that's just how life is. You're not for everyone. So I think I became a people pleaser in grad school, and I had to unlearn that. I had to like go to a weird place in order to write my true self.
All right, excellent. Are there any other questions you'd like to drop in the chat for Allison? Let's see, this is from Matthew. What lessons did you learn in writing Trashlands?
Well, I learned a hell of a lot about plastic. Um, my editors was really wonderful, and she said, "Even though it's fiction, I want you to learn as much as you can about plastic so that all the facts in there are true." So I learned about what plastic floats, what plastic sinks, what would disintegrate, what would hold up after 100 years, more than anybody should know about plastic who's not getting a degree in plastic or something. I also learned that writing from the point of view of many characters is very, very hard. That was I'd never done that before. I've never done that since, but there was something about Trashlands because it's so much about a community, and because I was so missing my community in Ohio, my community in Appalachian, Ohio, that I had to write from all of their voices. And that was a great, great experience that I hope to never do again because it was so hard. It was so hard to remember who says what and what would they think and what would they feel like and where are we in the timeline. But that being said, I don't think I've ever grieve the end of a book as much as I've written as much as I grieve the end of Trashlands. I mean, I've written a lot, and I've ended a lot. And when I had to turn in Trashlands for the last time, I cried really hard because I really felt like I knew these made up people. From being in their head, I learned so much about them. And so I think I learned the best way to know a character is to write from their point of view, to be in their head for sure.
And with that, you really felt like you were part of that community, right?
Yeah, I did. Community is so important to my life always, but in Trashlands, it became like the way you survive this hellish landscape is you have a family, you make a family, you find a family, and you make it work together, and you look out for each other, and that just became so central to the story.
With the, different perspectives that you wrote in, did you write them in order? Did you take time to focus on one character? Did you move back and forth?
I did write them in order. Again, like, probably not the best way to do it, but that's what I did. I wrote Coral for a few chapters, and then like I said, thought it was just gonna be Coral's book at first, but I really liked Foxglove. I really like characters that are mean and say what they think and are bitter, and I mean, I don't think I'm that way in real life, and I guess I want to be, so some wish fulfillment there. But I just thought, God, I wanna write from her voice, and so I did, and it was so fun. I thought, "Who else's voice can I write from?" So I did go straight through, and like I said, because I had those messy first drafts, afterwards, I had to go back and kinda make a reverse outline, and I kind of wrote down each character's journey on Post-it notes and tried to make sure, like, they fit in the timeline. So it was a lot of doctoring after the fact, but the first draft did have the multiple voices.
And was there a character that really sort of surprised you now knowing that you did this in order? Like, when you started one voice, were you just completely surprised by who they were?
I was surprised by Tahiti. I was surprised. I mean, I always do. I love community so much. I really love ensembles in my writing too. So I always start off with a character that, oh, this is just a minor character. This is like a helper on a side quest or something. But then I just end up really falling in love with them. And I really fell in love with Tahiti's voice and how he was so surprising and he wasn't what people expected of him. And he became really one of the most sympathetic male characters in the book and one of the ones you really root for. Um, I was kinda surprised at Rattlesnake Master. It was easy to write from his voice, but it was also, like, I really dreaded revising his chapters because he's so gross and so awful that I was just like, "Oh, no, I have to go back into Rattlesnake Master's head." But it was, kinda therapeutic in a way to kinda get all these feelings out there and just be wild, and use the mask of these characters to say kind of outlandish things.
All right. And does anybody else want to drop in a question? See, Matthew says, thanks for reading from your new book and sharing your insights and experiences today.
Excellent.
Um, Excellent. Another thank you. Before we go, do you want to talk a little bit about Dust?
Sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
Dustin's coming out next year. It's a different publisher. It's Wednesday Books Macmillan. And Dust is about a girl who is partially deaf, as I am. And this is the first time I've written openly about my disability in fiction, so I'm kind of nervous about that. Again, it's fiction, but it's me, it's my feelings. So, this girl moves with her family from Ohio to Colorado, and she begins to suspect that a second Dust Bowl is coming. And her family is a very strict unschooling family. They keep them at home. They don't want them to go to school. And so she meets someone else who's deaf for the first time, boy her age, who starts to teach her sign language in secret. And she starts to learn more about the valley around her. It's called the Bloodless Valley, and realize she's going to have to help her new community get to safety before the storm comes.
And when does that one come out?
It comes out in October of 2024.
All right. about a
feels
year from
far
now.
away, but
Yeah.
hopefully we'll still be around.
Yeah, it's true. All right, excellent. Does anybody have anything else they want to drop into the chat before we sign off here? I feel like I do want to ask you about the bus before we go.
Yeah.
So, so you were living in a bus briefly?
I was. I'm a single mom, like I said, and I have not historically gotten much time without my son. So anytime I had alone when he was with family, I would try to go somewhere for a weekend or something and write, like get a really cheap hotel room. And so I found this bus that was being rented as like a Airbnb or like a hotel room. And it was on the shore of a quarry lake. It was in Michigan. And so I rented that for the week. And the first night, I really do not remember what I went there to write. It was a different book that's lost now because that first night I dreamed about coral. But I mean I've always been interested in like tiny houses and campers, and that is in my first book as well. Um just the idea of remodeling a bus to live there sounds like a dream to me, a hard dream, but a fun dream. But I mean, my grandfather, all of my relatives were farmers, but to earn a little more money in the winter, my grandfather would drive a school bus. And so he would park the school bus on the farm. And I remember when I was a kid, me and my sister playing in the bus and reading there and stuff. So school bus has kind of always been in the back of my mind, I guess.
And do you think this school bus, this was the only way that Trashlands was gonna come to you? Like it
That's
was
a great question. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, maybe.
scary
Maybe.
to think about. You could have chosen a different Airbnb
I
and
could have chosen, like, a horrible hotel room and written, like, a murder mystery or something, but, you know.
all right. So, if nobody else has any questions, I think we'll stop there, Allison. Uh, let's see. I have to say some closing things though. Let me say these closing things. Well, do you have any reading recommendations before we go? Are there any books that you're really excited about right now?
Oh gosh, well, I'm a huge fan of Octavia Butler, in case you didn't know, and, Ursula K. Le Guin. They're big influences on my work, as is Angela Carter. Those are all women speculative writers. Right now, I'm actually reading a totally different book, though. It's like a dark academia book, but it has, like, a little darkness and magic in it. It's called All That Consumes Us, and it's very addictive. I keep, reading it really compulsively, which for me is the biggest compliment you can pay is if you stay up late at night reading.
Mm. That was called All That Consumes Us, and it's about academia.
It is,
That
yeah.
sure sounds about right, doesn't it?
Good fall read, I think.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for that. I hope everyone has a good National Novel Writing Month. Are you participating in? Have you ever, Allison?
Um, Kind of not a long time ago, like, I kind of tried to do that. I'm not participating, but I do definitely support the idea, and
Mm.
I do kind of, in general, that's kinda how I write too. I try to do, like, 1,000 words a day or an hour a day just to kinda get that first draft out there.
Yep. So I hope everyone's participating and having a good time. But I think that's it for today. Thank you again for joining us, Allison. That
Thank
was
you
really
so
great.
much. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.